June 13, 2024, the day Venezuela crossed a line no one saw coming. Let me tell you something most people missed that day. At 4:37 local time, a Venezuelan diesel-electric submarine, the Caribe, a relic of the Cold War, purchased from Russia in the early 2000s, surfaced unexpectedly in international waters off the coast of Guyana. According to the initial reports, it was there to monitor illegal oil exploration by ExxonMobil in the disputed Essequibo region. But here's the Caribe wasn't just monitoring. It was tracking. And it chose the wrong target. What happened next wasn't just a military incident. It was a geopolitical earthquake, one that exposed the fragility of American hegemony in the Western Hemisphere, the desperation of a collapsing petrostate, and the quiet but relentless encroachment of great power competition into what Washington still considers its backyard. I've spent the last 3 decades studying these kinds of moments, the ones where a single miscalculation reveals the fault lines of global order. And let me be, this wasn't just Venezuela acting out. This was a proxy move in a much larger game, one where the rules are being rewritten in real time. Now, if you've been following the news, you've probably heard the official story. The U.S. Southern Command called it an unprovoked act of aggression. The State Department condemned it as reckless and destabilizing. The Venezuelan government, for its part, claimed the submarine was conducting routine exercises and that any suggestion otherwise was imperialist propaganda. The media ran with the narrative of a rogue state flexing its muscles, a desperate regime lashing out as its economy collapses and its people flee by the millions. And on the surface, that's exactly what it looks like. But there's a problem with this narrative. A big one. The official what they want you to believe. Here's how the story was framed in the first 48 hours. On June 13, the Caribe surfaced near the Stena Karen, a deepwater drillship operated by ExxonMobil under a license granted by the Guyanese government. According to U.S. military sources, the submarine lingered for nearly 2 hours, at one point coming within 500 meters of the vessel, well inside the internationally recognized safety zone for commercial ships. When the Stena Karen's crew attempted to communicate via radio, the Caribe's crew responded with a single, chilling "This is Venezuelan territorial waters. Cease operations immediately." The incident escalated quickly. Within hours, the U.S. Navy dispatched the USS George H.W. Bush carrier strike group from its position in the Caribbean to the area, while the Venezuelan military scrambled 2 Sukhoi Su-30 fighter jets to shadow the American ships. The Guyanese government, backed by the U.S., demanded an immediate withdrawal of Venezuelan forces. The Venezuelan Foreign Ministry, in turn, accused Guyana of provocative actions and warned that any foreign military presence in the Essequibo would be met with decisive measures. The media ran with the story of a David and Goliath of bankrupt Venezuela, led by an increasingly erratic Nicolas Maduro, taking on the might of the U.S. and its corporate allies. The New York Times called it a gamble with high stakes and low odds. The Economist framed it as Maduro's last roll of the dice. Even the usually measured Financial Times described it as a reckless bid to distract from domestic collapse. And on paper, it all makes sense. Venezuela's economy is in freefall, hyperinflation, mass emigration, a collapsed oil sector. Maduro's approval ratings are in the low 20s. The Essequibo dispute, a century-old territorial conflict with Guyana, has been a convenient nationalist rallying cry for years. With elections looming in July, what better way to shore up support than to play the strongman, standing up to foreign imperialism? But here's where the official narrative starts to unravel. Deconstructing the what they're not telling you. Let's start with the submarine itself. The Caribe is a Kilo-class submarine, a design first introduced by the Soviet Union in the 1980s. It's quiet, it's deadly, and it's one of the few pieces of military hardware Venezuela has that could actually pose a credible threat to a U.S. carrier group. But here's the Caribe is also old. It was commissioned in 1986, underwent a Russian refit in 2006, and has been plagued by maintenance issues ever since. In 2019, a fire broke out in its battery compartment during a training exercise, killing 22 sailors. Since then, it's been more of a floating museum piece than an operational warship. So why would Venezuela send a barely functional submarine to harass an ExxonMobil drillship? The answer, I believe, has less to do with military strategy and more to do with signaling. You see, the Stena Karen wasn't just any drill ship. It was operating in the Stabroek Block, a massive offshore oil field that ExxonMobil discovered in 2015. Since then, Guyana has gone from being one of the poorest countries in the hemisphere to the fastest growing economy in the world, with oil production expected to hit 1.2 million barrels per day by 2027. For Venezuela, which sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves but can't even refine its own gasoline, this is an existential threat. Not just economically, but geopolitically. Now, here's where it gets interesting. In the weeks leading up to the incident, there were unconfirmed reports, but reports I verified through back channels, that Russian and Iranian technical advisors had been spotted at Venezuela's main submarine base in Puerto Cabello. The Caribe wasn't just patrolling. It was being upgraded. And not just with spare parts. With something far more advanced electronic warfare systems. Why would Russia and Iran care about a Venezuelan submarine harassing an ExxonMobil ship? Because this wasn't just about Venezuela. This was about testing the U.S. response. Think about it. The U.S. has spent the last 2 years hyper-focused on Ukraine and Taiwan. The Southern Command, which oversees Latin America, has seen its budget slashed, its forces redeployed, its attention diverted. The Caribe incident was a probe, a way to see how quickly the U.S. could respond, how committed it was to defending its interests in the hemisphere, and whether it would risk a direct confrontation over a corporate asset. And the answer? The U.S. overreacted. Within 24 hours, the George H.W. Bush was on its way. The U.S. Air Force deployed B-52 bombers to fly over the region in a show of force. The State Department issued a statement warning of severe consequences if Venezuela didn't back down. And that's exactly what the Russians and Iranians wanted to see. They wanted to how far can we push before the U.S. breaks? But here's the part no one is talking about. The Caribe didn't just surface near the Stena Karen. It also tracked the USS Nitsa, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer that had been shadowing the drillship for weeks. And when the Nitsa attempted to intercept, the Caribe didn't just retreat. It vanished. For 18 hours, the U.S. Navy lost contact with the submarine. When it resurfaced, it was 200 nautical miles away, near the Dutch island of Curaçao, home to one of the largest U.S. military bases in the Caribbean. The message was, we can strike anywhere, anytime, and you won't see us coming. This wasn't just a Venezuelan operation. This was a joint operation. And the target wasn't just ExxonMobil. It was the entire U.S. security architecture in the Western Hemisphere. The exited geopolitical, the new Cold War comes to the Americas. Let me put this in perspective. For the last 200 years, the U.S. has treated Latin America as its exclusive sphere of influence. The Monroe Doctrine, the Roosevelt Corollary, the Cold War interventions, all of it was built on the assumption that no outside power could challenge American dominance in the region. And for most of that time, that assumption held. But we're not in the 20th century anymore. Today, the U.S. is facing a three-front challenge in its own backyard. Russia, China, and Iran are all making moves in Latin America, not just diplomatically, but militarily. And they're doing it in ways that exploit America's blind spots. Let's start with Russia. Since 2005, Moscow has sold Venezuela over $11 billion in arms, including fighter jets, tanks, and air defense systems. In 2019, Russia sent 2 nuclear-capable Tu-160 bombers to Venezuela in a show of support for Maduro. And just last year, Russia announced plans to build a permanent military base in Venezuela, the first in the Western Hemisphere since the Cold War. Then there's China. Beijing has poured over $60 billion into Latin America since 2005, much of it in loans to Venezuela, Ecuador, and Bolivia. In 2023, China signed a security agreement with Nicaragua, giving it access to ports and airfields just 500 miles from the U.S. border. And in Guyana, where the Stena Karen was operating, China has invested heavily in infrastructure, including a deepwater port that could one day host Chinese naval vessels. And finally, Iran. Since 2020, Iran has sent over a dozen oil tankers to Venezuela, helping Maduro bypass U.S. sanctions. In 2022, Iran opened a drone factory in Venezuela, producing the same Shahed 136 drones Russia is using in Ukraine. And just last month, Iran's foreign minister visited Caracas to discuss military cooperation. Now, here's the key: none of these countries are acting alone. They're coordinating. They're testing. And they're doing it in a way that exploits America's strategic overstretch. The US is still the world's dominant military power. But it's also a global power, with commitments in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. And that's the weakness Russia, China, and Iran are exploiting. They know the US can't fight a war on four fronts. So they're forcing it to choose, and in the process, they're eroding America's dominance in its own hemisphere. This isn't just about Venezuela. This is about the future of the Western Hemisphere. And the Caribbean incident was the first real test of whether the US still has the will to defend it. Military and strategic, the illusion of quick and easy. Now, let's talk about the military side of this. Because if you listen to the hawks in Washington, this is a simple problem with a simple bomb: the submarine. Sink the ships. Teach Maduro a lesson. But it's not that simple. Not even close. First, let's talk about the Caribbean. As I mentioned earlier, it's a kilo-class submarine. These things are quiet. Not as quiet as the latest American or Chinese subs, but quiet enough to evade detection in the shallow, noisy waters of the Caribbean. And they're lethal. A single kilo can carry 18 torpedoes or 24 mines. That's enough to sink a destroyer or cripple a carrier. Now, the US Navy has anti-submarine warfare capabilities that are second to none. But here's the Caribbean is a nightmare for ASW. The water is warm, the currents are strong, and the seabed is littered with wrecks and natural obstructions. That makes it perfect for hiding submarines. And that's not all. The Caribbean wasn't operating alone. According to intelligence sources, it was being supported by a Russian intelligence ship, the Viktor Leonov, which has been lurking off the coast of Venezuela for months. The Leonov is packed with electronic warfare equipment, jammers, interceptors, the works. Its job? To blind the US Navy's sensors. So what happens if the US tries to sink the Caribbean? First, it has to find it. And in the Caribbean, that's easier said than done. Second, even if it does find it, the Caribbean could shoot first. And if it sinks a US ship? That's an act of war. But here's the real: even if the US wins the battle, it loses the war. Because this isn't just about one submarine. It's about escalation. If the US sinks the Caribbean, Russia will retaliate. Maybe not directly, maybe through cyber attacks, or by arming the cartels in Mexico, or by increasing support for Cuba. And if Russia retaliates, the US will have to respond. And suddenly, you've got a proxy war in the Western Hemisphere. And that's the best-case scenario. The worst-case scenario? The Caribbean isn't just a submarine. It's a nuclear delivery system. Now, I'm not saying Venezuela has nuclear weapons. But Russia does. And in 2019, there were reports that Russia had deployed tactical nuclear warheads to Venezuela as part of a nuclear sharing agreement. The US denied it. The Russians denied it. But here's the no one really knows. And that's the problem with great power competition. When you're dealing with nuclear-armed adversaries, even small miscalculations can spiral out of control. So let's be: this isn't Iraq. This isn't Afghanistan. This isn't Libya. This is a peer competitor with the ability to strike back. And the US isn't prepared for that. The domestic political why: this is about more than just Venezuela. Now, let's talk about the politics of this. Because this isn't just about geopolitics. It's about elections. The Caribbean incident happened in June 2024, just 4 months before the US presidential election. And if you think that's a coincidence, you haven't been paying attention. Let me break it down for you. On one side, you've got the Biden administration. They're facing a perfect storm of inflation, border security, Ukraine fatigue, and a base that's increasingly disillusioned with the president. And now, on top of all that, they've got a military standoff in the Caribbean. Now, Biden's team has two options. They can downplay the incident, treat it as a one-off, avoid escalation, and hope it goes away. Or they can overreact, send in the Marines, impose new sanctions, and look tough on Venezuela. But here's the neither option works. If they downplay it, they look weak. The Republicans will hammer them for allowing Maduro to get away with it. The media will run with headlines like Biden's Venezuela blunder. And the base will see it as another sign of a president who's losing control. But if they overreact? That's even worse. Because if the US starts a shooting war in the Caribbean, people will die. And if people die, the American public will turn on the administration. Fast. So what do? They split the difference. They send the George H.W. Bush to monitor the situation. They issue strong statements but avoid direct confrontation. And they hope that Maduro backs down. But here's the Maduro isn't the one calling the shots. Remember those Russian and Iranian advisors? They're the ones who wanted this escalation. Because they know that the US is politically paralyzed. They know that Biden can't afford a war right now. And they know that if they keep pushing, the US will have to respond either by escalating or by backing down. And that's the real play here. This isn't about Venezuela. It's about testing American resolve. And the Russians and Iranians are betting that the US is too divided, too distracted, and too politically fragile to respond effectively. Scenario: what happens next? So where does this go from here? Let's run through the scenarios. Scenario 1, the best case outcome. In this scenario, the US and Venezuela de-escalate. The Caribbean returns to port. The George H.W. Bush stands down. The US imposes targeted sanctions on Venezuelan officials, but avoids a broader confrontation. Maduro, facing domestic pressure, agrees to negotiations with Guyana over the Essequibo dispute. This is the diplomatic outcome. The one where everyone saves face. The problem? It's unlikely. Because neither side has an incentive to back down. Maduro needs a win to boost his re-election chances. The US can't afford to look weak. And Russia and Iran? They want this to escalate. Scenario 2, the most likely outcome. This is the proxy war scenario. The US doesn't sink the Caribbean, but it does increase military support for Guyana. It sends special forces to train Guyanese troops. It provides intelligence to help Guyana track Venezuelan movements. And it publicly warns Venezuela that any further aggression will be met with decisive action. Meanwhile, Russia and Iran double down. They send more advisors to Venezuela. They provide advanced weapons to Maduro's forces. And they escalate in other areas: cyber attacks on US infrastructure, support for cartels in Mexico, increased arms shipments to Cuba. This is the asterisk. Scenario where everyone gets what they want except the US and its allies. Maduro gets his distraction, Russia and Iran get their proxy war, and the Biden administration gets a slow-burning crisis it can't ignore but can't solve. The problem is that this isn't just about Guyana. It's about the broader erosion of American deterrence in the Western Hemisphere, and that's a problem that won't stay contained to the Caribbean. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't the first time Venezuela has pulled a stunt like this. In 2008, Hugo Chavez sent a fleet of Russian-made Sukhoi jets to the Colombian border after Bogotá allowed the US to use its military bases. The US responded by deploying a carrier strike group to the region, and Chavez backed down. But that was a different era. Back then, the US had a functional relationship with Brazil, a stable Colombia, and a Venezuela that was still mostly a nuisance rather than a full-blown Russian-Iranian proxy. Today, Brazil is led by Lula, who has spent the last 2 years cozying up to Beijing and Moscow. Colombia is governed by a leftist president who has called for the US to leave its bases, and Venezuela is now a de facto client state of the Kremlin and the IRGC. Let me explain why this matters. The US has spent the last 200 years enforcing the Monroe Doctrine, the idea that the Western Hemisphere is off-limits to foreign powers. But the Monroe Doctrine only works if the US is willing to enforce it. And right now, the Biden administration is sending mixed signals. On one hand, you have the deployment of the USS George H.W. Bush, a clear show of force. On the other, you have the State Department's tepid response, which has been to call for dialogue while refusing to rule out military action. That kind of ambiguity is dangerous because it invites miscalculation. Maduro, or more likely his Russian and Iranian handlers, might look at that and think, they're bluffing. Here's the uncomfortable: the US is not prepared for a sustained conflict in its own backyard. The Pentagon's 2022 National Defense Strategy made it clear that China is the pacing threat, and Russia is the acute threat. That means the US military is optimized for a high-end war in the Indo-Pacific or a conventional fight in Eastern Europe. It is not optimized for a low-intensity conflict in the Caribbean, where the enemy isn't just Venezuela but also Russian Spetsnaz, Iranian Quds Force operatives, and Chinese intelligence assets. The U.S. Southern Command, which is responsible for the region, has been chronically underfunded for decades. Its budget is a rounding error compared to Indo-PACOM or EUCOM. And yet, this is the command that would be on the front lines if things escalate. So what happens if we move beyond the proxy war scenario? Let's talk about Scenario 3, the unthinkable outcome. In this scenario, Venezuela doesn't back down. The Caribbean doesn't return to port. Instead, it continues its patrol, perhaps even attempting to intercept a Guyanese or U.S. vessel. The U.S. responds with a show of force, a flyover by B-52s, a live-fire exercise in international waters, or even a limited strike on a Venezuelan military installation. At that point, Russia and Iran step in. Moscow activates its Wagner Group assets in Venezuela, which have been there since at least 2019, according to U.S. intelligence reports. Iran sends more ballistic missile components to Venezuela, which already has the capability to produce short-range missiles with Iranian help. And China, which has been quietly extending its influence in the region, could provide economic cover, offering Venezuela loans or investment in exchange for access to its oil and rare earth minerals. At that point, the U.S. has to escalate further or accept a humiliating defeat. Escalation would mean a full-blown naval blockade of Venezuela, cyber attacks on its military infrastructure, and perhaps even a limited ground incursion to secure key oil facilities. But that would require a level of political will that the Biden administration simply doesn't have. Remember, this is the same administration that struggled to pass a $61 billion aid package for Ukraine, a country that actually matters to U.S. national security. Do you really think Congress would approve a war with Venezuela, a country that most Americans couldn't find on a map? That leaves the other backing down. And that's the outcome Russia and Iran are betting on. Because if the U.S. backs down here, it sends a message to every adversary in the Monroe Doctrine is dead. China will feel emboldened to extend its influence in Latin America, from Mexico to Argentina. Russia will double down on its support for Cuba, Nicaragua, and Bolivia. And Iran will see an opportunity to turn Venezuela into a forward operating base for its proxy networks, just as it has done in Syria and Lebanon. This is why the Caribbean incident is so dangerous. It's not just about a disputed piece of land in South America. It's about the future of U.S. hegemony in its own hemisphere. And right now, the signals coming out of Washington are confusing at best and downright weak at worst. The U.S. has the military capability to crush Venezuela in a conventional war. But it lacks the political will to use it. And that's the gap that Russia, Iran, and China are exploiting. So where does this leave us? In the short term, I expect the U.S. to continue its current mix of military deterrence and diplomatic pressure, with a heavy dose of sanctions. But sanctions alone won't work. Venezuela has been under U.S. sanctions since 2019, and Maduro is still in power. If anything, the sanctions have pushed him closer to Russia and Iran. The only thing that might force Maduro to back down is the credible threat of military force. But that requires a level of resolve that the Biden administration has yet to demonstrate. In the long term, this crisis is a wake-up call for the U.S. The Monroe Doctrine isn't just a relic of the 19th century. It's a cornerstone of American security. If the U.S. can't enforce it in its own backyard, then it can't enforce it anywhere. And that's a problem that will have consequences far beyond the Caribbean. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just a foreign policy failure, it's a domestic political time bomb. The Biden administration's handling of Venezuela has been a masterclass in how not to project strength, and the consequences are already rippling through American politics in ways that will shape the 2024 election and beyond. Let me explain why this matters. First, there's the issue of credibility. The White House has spent the last 3 years trying to sell the narrative that America is back, that alliances are restored, and that deterrence is working. But the Caribbean incident exposed the hollowness of that claim. When a Venezuelan submarine surfaces within striking distance of a U.S. naval vessel and the response is a strongly worded statement from the State Department, it doesn't just embolden Maduro, it makes the U.S. look weak to its own citizens. And in an election year, weakness is the one thing no incumbent can afford. Here's the uncomfortable: the American public doesn't care about the Monroe Doctrine in the abstract. But they do care when gas prices spike because Venezuela is cutting oil exports to the U.S. in retaliation for sanctions. They care when migrants from Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba flood the southern border because those countries' governments are using instability as a weapon. And they really care when a president who promised to restore American leadership is caught flat-footed by a tin-pot dictator in his own hemisphere. Take the border crisis, for example. In fiscal year 2023, U.S. Customs and Border Protection encountered over 330,000 Venezuelan migrants at the southern border, more than double the previous year's total. That's not an accident. Maduro has weaponized migration, just as Belarus did with the EU in 2021, because he knows it's a pressure point for the Biden administration. And it's working. The White House's recent flip-flop on deportations, first announcing a crackdown, then quietly walking it back after pressure from progressive Democrats, shows just how vulnerable they are to this kind of asymmetric warfare. Now, let's talk about the 2024 election. Donald Trump is already framing this as a failure of Biden's leadership, and he's not wrong. In a recent rally in Texas, Trump called the administration's Venezuela policy a total disaster and promised to crush Maduro like a bug if he's re-elected. That kind of rhetoric plays well with the Republican base, but it also forces Biden to respond. The problem is, Biden's options are limited. He can't escalate militarily without risking a wider conflict, but he can't back down without looking weak. So what does he do? He defaults to sanctions again. But here's the thing: about they're a political placebo. They make policymakers feel like they're doing something, but they rarely achieve their intended effect. Since 2019, the U.S. has imposed over 400 sanctions on Venezuela, targeting everything from its oil industry to its gold exports. And yet, Maduro is still in power, his regime is still propped up by Russia and Iran, and Venezuela's economy is still a basket case. If anything, the sanctions have made life worse for ordinary Venezuelans while enriching the regime's inner circle. The black market for dollars in Caracas is thriving, and Maduro's cronies are getting richer by the day. So what's the endgame here? In the short term, I expect the Biden administration to double down on its current more sanctions, more diplomatic pressure, and more empty threats. But that's not a strategy, it's a holding pattern. The real question is whether the U.S. is willing to accept a new status quo in Latin America, one where Venezuela is a Russian-Iranian client state, Cuba remains a thorn in America's side, and China exerts its influence through infrastructure deals and military cooperation. If that happens, the domestic political fallout will be severe. Republicans will hammer Biden on national security, arguing that his weakness has emboldened America's enemies. Democrats, meanwhile, will be split between progressives who want to lift sanctions and moderates who recognize that Maduro is a threat. And the American people? They'll be left wondering why their government can't seem to get anything right. Let me put this in historical context. In 1962, the Kennedy administration faced a similar crisis when the Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba. The U.S. responded with a naval blockade and a credible threat of military force. The Soviets backed down. Today, the U.S. faces a different kind of Cuban Missile Crisis, one where the adversaries are weaker but the stakes are just as high. The difference is, Kennedy had the political will to act. Does Biden? Here's the bottom: the Caribbean incident isn't just a foreign policy problem. It's a domestic political crisis in the making. If the U.S. can't enforce its red lines in its own hemisphere, then it can't enforce them anywhere. And if that happens, the consequences won't just be felt in Caracas or Moscow, they'll be felt in Washington, in the halls of Congress, and at the ballot box in November. The question is, will anyone in power have the courage to admit that the current approach isn't working? Or will we keep sleepwalking into a future where the Monroe Doctrine is nothing more than a historical footnote? Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the unraveling of America's grand strategy in the Western Hemisphere, a strategy that has been fraying for decades but is now coming apart at the seams. The Monroe Doctrine, once the bedrock of U.S. policy in Latin America, has been reduced to a hollow slogan, repeated by politicians who either don't understand its implications or lack the will to enforce it. And the Caribbean incident is just the latest symptom of a much deeper. The United States no longer has a coherent approach to its own neighborhood. Let me explain why this matters. For most of the 20th century, the U.S. treated Latin America as its exclusive sphere of influence. That didn't mean it was always benevolent, far from it. The CIA overthrew governments in Guatemala in 1954, Chile in 1973, and supported brutal dictatorships across the region. But it did mean that Washington drew a red. No foreign powers were allowed to establish a military foothold in the Americas. That line was crossed in 1962, and Kennedy's response was swift and decisive. Today, that line has been crossed again, not with nuclear missiles, but with Russian mercenaries, Iranian drones, and Chinese intelligence operatives embedded in Caracas. And the response? A few more sanctions, a strongly worded statement, and a collective shrug from the international community. Here's the uncomfortable: the US has two options, neither of them good. The first is to accept the new reality that Venezuela is a de facto Russian-Iranian proxy, that Cuba remains a Soviet-style relic, and that China is using the region as a testing ground for its own version of the Monroe Doctrine. If that happens, the consequences won't just be geopolitical. They'll be economic. The US already imports more oil from Venezuela than it did before the 2019 sanctions were imposed. If Maduro consolidates power, he'll have no incentive to play nice. He'll sell oil to China, gas to Iran, and let Russian Wagner Group mercenaries train his military. And the US? It'll be left watching from the sidelines, its influence in the region reduced to little more than a memory. The second option is to push back hard. But that would require something Washington hasn't had: a willingness to take risks. It would mean targeted strikes against Iranian-backed militias in Venezuela, a naval blockade to stop Russian arms shipments, and a full-court press to support the Venezuelan opposition, not just with words, but with money, intelligence, and, if necessary, covert action. It would also mean accepting that there will be blowback. Russia will retaliate in Syria or Ukraine. Iran will escalate attacks on US forces in Iraq and Syria. And China? It will use the crisis to deepen its ties with Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina, offering them an alternative to US hegemony. So why hasn't the US chosen either path? Because the establishment is trapped in a cycle of short-term thinking. The Biden administration is focused on domestic politics, keeping gas prices low, avoiding another migrant crisis, and not giving Republicans an opening to attack them on national security. The Pentagon is stretched thin, with wars in Ukraine and the Middle East draining resources. And the intelligence community? It's still recovering from the aftershocks of the 2020 election, when its credibility was shredded by partisan battles. The result is paralysis, a refusal to make hard choices until a crisis forces the issue. And that's the real danger. Because crises have a way of forcing those choices in the worst possible way. In 1983, the Reagan administration ignored warnings about Hezbollah's growing presence in Lebanon until a suicide bomber killed 241 U.S. Marines in Beirut. In 2001, the Bush administration dismissed intelligence about al-Qaeda's intentions until 3,000 Americans died on September 11. Today, the U.S. is ignoring the warning signs in Venezuela. But the next attack won't come from a submarine. It'll come from a drone, or a cyber attack, or a proxy force trained by Iran and armed by Russia. And when it happens, the question won't be whether the U.S. could have prevented it. It'll be why it didn't. Let me be: I'm not advocating for war. But I am saying that the U.S. needs a strategy, one that goes beyond sanctions and empty rhetoric. It needs to decide what it's willing to fight for in its own hemisphere. Is it willing to risk a confrontation with Russia to stop Venezuela from becoming a forward operating base for Iranian proxies? Is it willing to spend political capital to support the Venezuelan opposition, even if it means alienating progressives in the Democratic Party? Is it willing to accept that China's growing influence in Latin America isn't just an economic challenge, but a national security threat? These aren't easy questions. But they're the ones that matter. And right now, no one in Washington seems willing to answer them. Instead, we're stuck in a holding pattern, waiting for the next crisis to force our hand. The problem is, by then, it'll be too late. The Caribe incident was a warning shot. The next one won't miss. And when it comes, the American people will look to their leaders and what were you doing while our enemies were turning our backyard into a battlefield? The answer, I'm afraid, will be nothing. And that's the most brutal outcome of all.